Yes.
This might be for Dr. Mavakio. I just have a question in regards to discoid lupus. Is it possible that discoid evolved into systemic? I've got a lot of mixed answers on that, and I'm just trying to find out if that's a very possible issue.
So yes, that's possible. I mean, in general, when we meet someone with discoid lupus, we actually try to check to see if it's part of an underlying systemic disease. And there's ways to predict, for example, if the person has, antibody production, this increases the chance that they will develop an underlying systemic. And usually if it's going to happen, it's not many years apart. So I think you could be a little bit unlucky, but on the other hand too, this is also related to your question. There are one of the things, and I don't think this is necessarily specific to lupus, but in general for even like rheumatoid arthritis, even more common than lupus. We see a lot of people who just don't feel well, and they might describe it as just malaise or fatigue, and some of these people they get passed around doctor to doctor, oh, depression or something. And sometimes I think some of these patients, they've bothered me enough that I will, even though I don't have a diagnosis of them, I will just follow them. And so some people, 5 years later, 10 years later, they actually do have something. And maybe at the beginning they just have, an abnormal lab, but there's no clinical disease otherwise apparent that, I can make a diagnosis. But back to your question, when someone has discoid lesions, we always want to know, could they be having, systemic lupus too? And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but we do check them for it, and usually once it's just discoid lupus and they've had that for many years, they don't develop systemic later.
Right, but in the 70s, my second question, sorry. But in the 70s, though, was there kind of more looked for? Was lupus that, spread around to where it's possible it's discoid, it could be systemic?
The 70s?
Yes, sir.
I don't remember that time, but no, just
I wasn't even born.
Yeah, I think we have improved. I mean, we were having a discussion earlier about, robots trying to do the work of physicians. And to me, this is a good example of where I don't think I could be replaced. Because, I'll ask questions and I'll look for things to try to convince myself whether the person has lupus or not. And I think this is one reason why it can be difficult to make a diagnosis of this, like in the primary care setting where, you got to go quick, you got to get to the next patient. And I have some of that pressure, to see enough patients to keep my doors open, but I run over just to convince myself whether or not I need to be worried about this patient. So go through organ system by organ system, ask, look, examine, and try to see if there's something there that could say, oh, this person could have a systemic autoimmune disease. And if you don't go through all the systems and you miss something, then, could be developing at such a subtle rate. So this is another thing that makes it separate than kids, that sometimes, it can take years to really manifest itself.
Okay.
Yes, so I agree, discoid lupus. So we have some patients with discoid lupus that never develop systemic disease, and maybe about 10%, depending on where you look, might develop systemic lupus. And what I usually do in my practice is once the diagnosis of discoid lupus is made, do that thorough evaluation, asking questions, doing lab work, and because it can evolve and it can take time, we do that yearly, looking for any suggestion or any other symptoms or change in health. And so, it can be difficult to predict initially, and then some, like I said, some people never develop systemic lupus, and So there are studies being done, research being done to try to figure out what are some clues early on to predict if someone is going to develop systemic lupus. And hopefully we'll get there soon.
So the other key thing to your question though is, in terms of how do we make the diagnosis in the first place, to differentiate discoid lupus from systemic lupus from subacute cutaneous lupus, has to do with your symptoms, your physical exam, and then very importantly, what Dr. Mahakya was referring to was the laboratory tests. And so we will see kids with discoid lupus as young as maybe 2 years old, and that's pretty easy because it's very rare to see a child with lupus under 5, with systemic lupus. But so we'll still do all of the screening tests for the antibodies and for complement levels and for kidney disease for lupus. And then depending on the age of the patient and how their discoid symptoms evolve, and if they develop other symptoms, we'll repeat those labs over time. So there's something called complement levels that are crucial to the activity of whether you have discoid disease or systemic disease. Antibodies like DNA antibodies and Smith antibodies and RNP antibodies and antiphospholipid antibodies, those are things we routinely screen for all the time to differentiate discoid disease from systemic disease. And I think within our groups we recognize the difficulty, and so there's, since the 70s, there was what's called the ACR, American College of Rheumatology, criteria for diagnosing systemic lupus. And over the decades, those criteria have been evaluated and reevaluated and tried to improve upon that. So the newer criteria are called SLIC criteria, SLICC criteria, and those are in evolution to try to see if we can pick up, if you will, milder cases or more atypical cases of lupus. And the problem in general with rheumatology, even for us, and I'm sure for Dr. Mahakya, is that we all see very atypical disease presentations where, our favorite phrase is you didn't read the book, which means you didn't follow what's the textbook response that you will be told, gee, you've got discoid disease for 3 years, you don't have systemic symptoms, you're home free, you should not probably develop systemic lupus. And the problem with that is that there's outliers to all of those general guidelines and rules where people do go on and they're the, one out of whatever patient that actually goes on from discoid to systemic disease.
Okay.
So we always tell people what to look for.
Right.
It's easy to, after a while, to begin to think that you're not going to change, right? You're going to stay discoid.
Thank you.
Strange things happen.